Okay, you're all very welcome to the LGBTQIA plus History Club. My name's Joe Walsh. I'm the recently appointed Development Officer to the Heritage Project, working alongside Mary Ellen, who's kindly helped me arrange this club this evening. This is my first one. So the History Club is run in conjunction with the Belfast Linen Hall Library, and it's a partnership project between Here and I, the Rainbow Project, and Cara Friend. So tonight we'll be treated to an absolutely fascinating presentation by the wonderful Michael Fryer on queer life during the Second World War, subtitled "What Went On Was Nobody's Business." Michael has a master's in museum studies and is also a volunteer of our History Club. And then after the presentation, we'll have time for some questions for anybody who wants to ask those. Okay, so without further delay, Michael, it's over to you. Thank you so much for this evening.
Thanks, Joe. I'm glad you're describing it as fascinating before you've heard it. So I hope I live up to that really generous description. So thank you. As Joe said, my name is Michael Fryer. I'm a volunteer with the Heritage Project. And I work for the Northern Ireland War Memorial, which is a Second World War museum based in the Cathedral Quarter in Belfast. Apologies to those of you who have maybe heard a version of this talk before. I know, Nigel, you were at the version I gave of this talk back in February for LGBT History Month for the Northern Ireland War Memorial. I have added some new elements in, but hopefully you'll find it interesting. And as Joe said, I'd be very glad to take any questions or comments at the end. I'm by no means an expert on this area, and I'm sure many of you will know more than I do, but hopefully you'll find this interesting. And as Joe said, my presentation tonight is on queer life during the Second World War. What went on was nobody's business, which is a quote I'll come back to later, which was from a queer man who was describing his experiences during the Second World War. And really, I'm going to be talking primarily about the experiences of queer people in the UK and in Ireland during World War II. But as most of us, I take it, are based in Northern Ireland, and certainly the Heritage Project is based in Northern Ireland, I'll be trying to make a lot of local references throughout as well. I thought I'd start with a novel which is set during the Second World War, probably one of the most famous local novels set during the war by a local author, Brian Moore, who was born in Clifton Street in Belfast in 1921 and actually worked as a first aider at an air raid precautions post during the Belfast Blitz. And in this 1965 novel, he tells the story of Gavin Burke, who is a teenager, like Moore himself, works in an air raid precautions post in the early months of the Second World War. And it's really a sort of autobiographical novel, I suppose. Moore very much draws in his own experiences when he's developing the character of Gavin Burke. And there's one particular scene that's very significant for our purposes when Gavin comes across three individuals in a youth club in Belfast. One of them is the Reverend Kevin McMurtry, who's a Protestant minister, a former rugby player. And then the other two characters, Matthew Ware and Maurice Markham, are two rather camp young men who are playing with a puppet theatre in this particular youth club. And although Gavin initially describes his kind of attraction to this scene, it seems very cultured to him. They're actually burning joss sticks, and it just seems so exotic and far removed from his quite strict Catholic upbringing. The penny finally drops when he's leaving, and his friend Freddie really brings him to the realization that these three men are actually all gay. And this is a quote from the novel. Homosexuals. So this is kind of Gavin's inner monologue. He's sort of thinking to himself a lot of the time in the novel. Homosexuals, I warned you. This Freddie would introduce you to bad companions, and you were charmed by them. You even wanted to imitate them. think that one over. So Gavin's kind of appalled at the realization that these three men are actually gay, and I think this description of gay men in Belfast during the Second World War, it's relatively rare, actually, from what I understand. Certainly, I haven't found many first-hand references or eyewitnesses references to gay life in Belfast during the Second World War. But I think it's also a reminder to us of that world that must indeed have existed behind closed doors in wartime Belfast. It's a world, for example, that's alluded to by the English artist Neville Johnson, who was living in Belfast during the Second World War. And this is how Johnson later described Belfast during those years. This is a photograph of Belfast just to set the scene from the 1930s in High Street. This is what Johnson said about Belfast during the war. He said, "People talk of the swinging 60s as a breakaway to license, as a nose thumb to convention. But even in the 40s, in sturdily provincial Belfast, the seeds of revolt were pushing through the fabric. On the surface, it was a polite society. But beneath this crust, in nests of anarchy and deviation, fanned and feathered by children of the manse, orgies took place and mayhem prevailed." So I think that's a really interesting description. Orgies taking place in provincial Belfast during the war. And maybe we'll get some more insights into what was going on behind closed doors in Belfast later. Perhaps, though, one of the most obvious ways in which the Second World War affected the lives of queer people was through their service in the armed forces. Now, you might not know that there was no conscription in Northern Ireland during the war. The Stormont government did talk about bringing it in on a couple of occasions, but really, primarily for political reasons, it was never actually brought in Northern Ireland. But in Great Britain, conscription was brought in, so that by the end of 1941, all men between the ages of 18 and 51 and unmarried women between the ages of 20 and 30 were eligible to be called up for military service. And that meant, of course, that tens of thousands of queer people found themselves in uniform during the war. Indeed, one estimate puts it as high as 400,000 queer people serving in uniform in the Second World War in the British Armed Forces. 400,000 out of about 6.5 million. And what seems clear is that the demand for manpower during the war meant that the authorities often ignored a recruit's sexuality during the required medical examination, even when that was manifestly obvious. Meet Terry Gardner, who, as you can see in this photograph, was a drag queen, a very successful drag queen, actually, before the war. This is a photograph of Terry in 1946. And Terry was called up for conscription in England during the war. And he was really desperate to avoid being conscripted into the armed forces because he had had such a successful career as a drag queen. He didn't want to interrupt that. It was quite lucrative to him. And so he asked his friends about what he should do, and they suggested that if he wanted to continue in show business and be turned down for armed service, he should really camp it up when it came to the medical board, really camp it up, be completely outrageous, and then they would have to turn him down. And unfortunately for Terry, despite his very best efforts, despite all that experience he had as a drag queen of camping it up, he was unsuccessful. He passed the medical board and he was conscripted into the Royal Navy as a cook. And indeed, historian Emma Vickers, who's written about same-sex desire in the British Armed Forces during the war, she suggests that in the event that queer men and women were actually identified by the medical boards, it's actually likely that most were accepted because the authorities were determined not to let anybody shirk their duty. And indeed, there was a perception that these queer recruits could be straightened out, no pun intended, by military discipline and military service. So what was life like then for the likes of Terry Gardner and for those men and women who identified as queer who were serving in uniform during the war? Some of the richest sources of information we have are the oral history accounts by men and women who were often interviewed later in life about their experiences during the war. And what comes across from many of these accounts from queer veterans is that being brought together with members of the same sex in an environment that was encouraging physical intimacy and encouraging the formation of close personal relationships. Those opportunities meant that there were lots of I suppose there was lots of potential for queer men and women to explore same-sex desire. One RAF veteran recalled 60 years later, quote, "Let's face it, you're queer and you're surrounded by men. I was living in a man's world and I was queer, and you can't ask for much more than that." Similarly, Sarah Allen, who was interviewed in 1990, described the start of the war as a godsend because it meant that she could finally escape a succession of boring boyfriends she had been dating. She joined the ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, which was the women's branch of the British Army, and there she discovered a small contingent of queer women in her unit, and she experienced her first physical relationship with a woman during her wartime service. And certainly there were long-standing practices already embedded within the services that lent themselves to same-sex activity. For example, in the Royal Navy, there were what were called wingers and oppos. And wingers were really officers, men who were more senior to younger or more junior sailors who were meant to mentor new recruits. And the oppos were sailors of a similar age and rank to recruits who are expected to guide them. This is John Beardmore, who, as you can see, was in the Arctic during the war. He's all wrapped up there. And he talked about the wingers and oppos system. He joined the Navy in 1939 as a teenager, eventually became a sub-lieutenant on the Arctic convoys. And he recalled how some young married officers had wanted to become his winger, and not always with a purely philanthropic motive in mind, because remember, they were meant to be mentoring the younger recruits. Of the oppo relationship, he said it was much more equal. This is how he described the relationship. Quote, "You shared duties and he looked after your tot when you were in duty and put you to bed when you came back from shore pissed. It was largely platonic, but in some cases it developed into a sexual relationship which went on after the war had ended. I know of fellows who were oppos and who were having affairs at this time who went on to become the godfathers to each other's children." Similarly, in the Army and the RAF, there was the system of employing young men who were called batmen to serve as personal assistants or personal servants to officers. And again, we know from first-hand accounts that sometimes those relationships did develop into sexual relationships. Of course, as you maybe picked up from John Beardmore's description of the upper relationship in the Navy, many of these men would not have identified as being queer. And indeed, as John Beardmore said, a number of them went on to become the godfathers to each other's children. Many of them, I'm sure, had wives or girlfriends back home. And in fact, what seems to have happened is that the need for sexual relief, coupled with the fear of catching an STI from visiting a brothel while ashore, meant that otherwise heterosexual servicemen would quite happily use their queer comrades to satisfy their needs. So, for example, Dennis Prattley, who was a rating in the Navy during the war, he talked in a 1998 BBC Time Watch documentary about his pride in fulfilling an emotional function for many men aboard his ship. He said that he made, quote, a lot of boys happy, and that he, quote, did his bit for his country, with one of his crewmates telling him that he reminded him of his girl back home. And obviously there were limits to these wartime relationships. One RAF airman called Charles Pether recalled how he bumped into a former sexual partner on the train after the war, and he said the man couldn't get out of the train compartment more quickly enough. He obviously did not want to remember this relationship that they'd had during the war. Quite apart from sex, queer men also clearly played an important role in keeping up military morale during the Second World War. I mentioned Terry Gardner, who was a drag queen during the war, turned Navy cook, and he regularly entertained his comrades by camping it up during the war years. Terry said this, quote, "Everyone likes to laugh, whatever the circumstances. And believe me, there were some dreadful, dreadful circumstances, especially on the Western approaches. People were just thankful to get through the day. And of course, if I was around to give them a laugh, it was a bonus, wasn't it?" Similarly, John Beardmore, serving in the Navy, he recalled a coder on his ship who had been a chorus boy in peacetime and whose action station was to relay the messages from the captain to the forward guns. And to ease the tension of battle, when the captain issued orders to fire, this coder simply told the forward guns, "Open fire, dear." Beardmore described him as follows. He says, "He was called Freddie and was immensely popular on ship. Everybody loved him and he loved everybody else. And supposedly Freddie, because he'd been a chorus boy, he was great at impersonating stars such as Vera Lynn and Gracie Fields whenever the stress of battle became too much for everyone. One army veteran also described two queer men under his command capping it up just as they were about to disembark from their landing craft during the D-Day landings, including one of them putting on lipstick as they were approaching the beaches, saying, "I must look pretty for the Germans." And as this veteran later described these two men, he said, "You couldn't help but laugh at them, not because they were inadequate, but because they had the bloody courage to laugh. They had this amazing capacity to see the ridiculous part of life. I think they felt they'd got to be brave in front of the straight lot." Clearly then, camping it up was often as much about the queer serviceman proving his courage to his comrades as it was about keeping everyone's morale up during really difficult times. That was to mention some of the men who'd served during the war, but of course there were plenty of women served in the armed forces as well. And this photograph shows members of the WAF, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, serving during the war. And again, there are plenty of stories, plenty of oral history accounts of women experiencing same-sex desire and being in same-sex relationships in the forces during the war. For example, one Scottish veteran of the WAF, Elizabeth Reed Simpson, who was recorded in 1998 for the Imperial War Museum's oral history interviews. She remembered that there were quite a few lesbians in the WAF. Now, Elizabeth was based at RAF Ballyhalbert in County Down, and she recalled at that station, she came across a female couple who slept together. And after complaining about the noise coming from where they were meant to be on night duty, whatever they were getting up to, Elizabeth was told this by another woman. She told her, "Where were you brought up? Don't you know anything? They're lesbians and they always manage to get posted together. They don't fancy you, so get back to bed and don't bother about them." And when Elizabeth was asked by the oral history interviewer, "Were any of your fellow women annoyed about this relationship, or were they ever disciplined?" she said it was simply ignored, the fact that this relationship was taking place. And clearly, as this other lady said, they managed to pull strings and get posted to each station where they were serving together. So that's just one example of a lesbian relationship that was taking place here in Northern Ireland during the war. Now, perhaps I should mention at this point the amazing story of Jonathan Ferguson, known as Joy Ferguson in Lurgan in County Armagh, and born in Lurgan in 1915. And I should give credit, I know Tom Hulme is on this call. I have to give a lot of credit to Tom for this talk because he gave me so much help in researching it earlier this year. And Tom was the person who pointed out Jonathan's story to me. So Jonathan was born Joy Irene Ferguson in Lurgan in County Armagh in 1915. And Jonathan served as a female pilot with the Air Transport Auxiliary, the ATA, during the war. Supposedly, Jonathan was not regarded by colleagues during his time in the ATA as a lesbian woman, although even during that period, it was felt he was presenting a rather masculine appearance for a woman of this time. And in 1958, working as a civil servant in London, Jonathan then underwent gender reassignment and changed his name from Joy to Jonathan, something that received some press attention at the time. And you can see a newspaper clipping here from 1958 recording Jonathan's transition from Joy. Jonathan also managed to get his name and sex changed on his original birth certificate in Northern Ireland, as well as the entry in the original register of births changed, which is something that was highly unusual at the time. And actually, when I was looking more into Jonathan's story during the summer, I looked at the original birth certificate or the original register from the General Register Office in Northern Ireland. And one of the things I noticed was that it says that the original entry was changed in 1955 on production of a statutory declaration by Jessie Robertson Ferguson. And Jessie Robertson Ferguson was Jonathan's mother. And I thought that was really touching that in 1955, Jonathan's mother was willing to actually vouch for the fact that he had been born, even though he'd been born a woman, his gender was actually male, and his name should be Jonathan, not Joy. So his mother had actually vouched for him and had made that declaration in 1955, and I thought that was very touching. And very sadly, Jonathan died in an accident at home in Berkshire in 1974. But Nina Baker, who runs a blog called the Women Engineers History Blog, Nina's done a lot of research into Jonathan's early life, and certainly she's very keen to hear from anyone who has any information about particularly Jonathan's early years in Lurgan and his education at Lurgan College, and she'd love to hear from anybody who maybe has any more information about Jonathan's early life. Now, in relating these stories, I don't want to give the impression that somehow queer people didn't have any problems serving in the armed forces, because of course, under military law, as under civilian law at the time, same-sex activity between men was a disciplinary offence, and certainly much of a queer man's survival in the armed forces seemed to depend very much on the willingness of his comrades to turn a blind eye, and perhaps also the particular culture of a military unit, or indeed how discreet the individual servicemen involved were. Interestingly, though, Emma Vickers, whom I mentioned already, she has shown that the charge of what was called indecency was actually not a major problem for the armed forces during the war. With only about 1,800 servicemen in the Army, Royal Navy and RAF facing a court-martial for indecency out of something like 5.9 million men who served during the course of the war. So that's a relatively small number of men who were actually prosecuted for indecency in the armed forces during World War II. In the women's services, although same-sex activity was not punishable under military law, it was officially disapproved of, particularly in cases where it was shown to be disruptive to military discipline. I have a quote here from the director of the WAF, who was Jane Trefessis Forbes, and she wrote about lesbianism in 1941 in a memo. She said this: "In approaching an airwoman or officer whom we are fairly convinced is a lesbian, or in approaching one whose behavior is such as to suggest she is, we should point out to her that her behavior is that of a schoolgirl, and that these sentimental attachments are not what we expect from airwomen who must necessarily always set an example to others. That unless she can behave herself as a sensible adult, we consider that she will have a detrimental effect on discipline generally, and we would have to dispense with her services." So the perception in the WAF, and I think it's fair to say in the other women's branches of the armed forces, the ATS and the RENs, was that this is kind of schoolgirl behavior. It's immature, and they really need to kind of grow up. So it doesn't seem to have been treated as seriously as in the mainstream armed forces. Now, I have talked a lot about the armed forces, but of course there was the home front as well, the civilian experience of the Second World War. And obviously we can't forget that, because that obviously affected the experiences of queer men and women too. So, for example, historian Matt Holbrook has written a terrific book about queer London that includes the period between 1939 and 1945. And he mentions that there were well-established public and commercial queer networks from at least the 1920s in places like Blackpool, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, and Brighton, all of which seem to have been in full swing during the war. In London itself, there were plenty of queer bars, clubs, and cafes, while men looking for sex with other men were often able to find it in public toilets and parks across the city. And the blackout, which was brought in at the very start of the war and was certainly something that many people remember about the experience of the Second World War, that also seems to have helped this kind of activity. So Quentin Crisp, whom many of you might remember, was an author and actor, wrote his famous work, The Naked Civil Servant, later on in his life, and who incidentally was one of the very few queer men that we know was turned down for military service, because he turned up the medical board with dyed hair and plucked eyebrows, and even Quentin Crisp was just too much for the medical board he was appearing in front of. But he said this of London at the time. This is his description: "The city became like a paved double bed. Voices whispered suggestively as you walked along. Hands reached out if you stood still, and in dimly lit trains, people carried on as they had once behaved only in taxis. Once when I emerged from Leicester Square Underground Station, I asked an invisible passerby where I was. He kissed me on the lips, told me I was in Newport Street and walked on. I think that's a very evocative description of what life was like in London during the blackout. Incidentally, it's worth mentioning in passing that Crisp also loved the Americans, of whom there were something like 1.5 million of them came to the UK during the war, including 300,000 to Northern Ireland. And indeed, this year is the 80th anniversary of the Americans arriving in Northern Ireland for the very first time. This is what Crisp said of the Americans. He said, "They flowed through the streets of London like cream on strawberries, like melted butter on peas. Above all, it was the liberality of their natures that was so marvelous. Never in the history of sex was so much offered to so many by so few." And I don't think it's any wonder that later on Crisp famously moved to New York and spent the rest of his life in the USA. So I think it's fair to say during the war, Quentin Crisp certainly got to get to know the Americans pretty well from that description. Now, that was a description of London during the war, and what was true of London was also true, of course, albeit on a smaller scale for provincial cities like Belfast. For example, Jeff Dudgeon and Doug Sobey have told me that they knew someone some years after the war in the 70s or the 80s, I think it was. But he was a countryman who lived beyond Lisburn. He was in his early 20s during the war. And he was very put out by the large numbers of people who fled Belfast during the Belfast Blitz in 1941. And many of these people did what was called ditching. So they slept in the countryside, in the Castlereagh Hills, up Cave Hill, Black Mountain, to get away from the air raids. And the reason this man was so annoyed was because this is where he used to meet a soldier friend for sex out in the countryside. So they were interrupting his cruising ground effectively. Also worth mentioning in connection with Belfast is this bar, Dubarry's, which was well known for many, many years after the war as a queer venue. And it was just off Queen Square behind the Albert Clock. It was also somewhere that was frequented by sex workers. And you can see this is an advert for Dubarry's from the Belfast Telegraph in 1944. "Do you need a change of outlook?" And there's a little rhyme there, and it says, "Dubarry's of Princess Street, 1 minute from the Albert Clock. Good liquor, good music, atmosphere. I'll let you decide what atmosphere refers to." And interestingly, I've been told again by Tom Hulme, who many of you know as an historian at Queen's University, that police records show that in 1941, a soldier was caught with a civilian at the nearby Queen's Quay, and certainly that area around the dock seems to have been something of a busy cruising ground. And that brings me on to a couple of case studies. Again, Tom has very kindly pointed these out to me. And these are examples of local same-sex activity during the war. Although as so often is the case with queer history, we only know about them because the men involved were caught and charged by the authorities. Now, one of these incidents took place in Great Victoria Street in Belfast on the night of 26th November 1939, when a soldier, Robert James Jess, approached a civilian, Walter Bradshaw, and asked him for a cigarette. Now, bear in mind, as I understand it, asking for a light or a cigarette was often a pickup tactic at the time to find out if the other man was interested. And in this case, according to the newspaper report of the trial, Bradshaw gave Jess a cigarette and they got into conversation. Jess said he was not going back to his barracks that night as he was late and he would be punished, and he would have to stay out all night. And so he then said he wouldn't mind a cup of tea. And at this point, they then went back to Bradshaw's aunt's house in Wesley Street. And this is where we don't know exactly what happened. Bradshaw claimed that Jess, the soldier, attacked him in the parlor of his aunt's house. He punched him in the mouth, hit him on the head with an ornament, and threw him on the ground. And when he came to, he said Jess then hit him with a flower pot, and Bradshaw was knocked out again. Eventually, he managed to shout for help, and his cousin and his aunt came on the scene. Unfortunately for Jess, who had already left by this point, he left behind his gas mask and an insurance card with his name on it. And the police therefore then traced him to Willowfield Barracks. And when they arrested him, in the statement he gave to the police, Jess said that it was the other way around in terms of what happened. He said that Bradshaw was the one who had attacked him and that he had knocked the flower pot out of Bradshaw's hand whenever he had tried to hit him with it. However, given that Jess then refused to give evidence in court when he went on trial in January 1940, And given the fact that Bradshaw had also been very, very badly injured, he'd really been very badly knocked about, the jury found Jess, the soldier, guilty of assault after deliberating for less than 2 minutes, and he was sentenced to 12 months imprisonment with hard labour. Now, we will never know exactly what happened, but again, I know Tom has looked at the original file, the original criminal file in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, and it is much more explicit in terms of the sexual element of this case than the newspaper report states, including the fact that Jess was actually charged with assault with the intent to commit buggery. So certainly the authorities saw it as an attempt to have same sex relations. The other case I want to mention took place in Derry, Londonderry. And this took place in May 1944. And according to the coverage of the case in the Londonderry Sentinel, 2 Royal Canadian Navy sailors, Thomas McMahon and Raymond Lindstrom, were charged with larceny, which is what we would today call theft, of money from a US Army Lieutenant, Ernest Bartos. Lieutenant Bartos, this US Army officer, told police that he left Belfast with 2 Army nurses on a 5:25 p.m. train for Derry, and they had a number of drinks. And he added, "I must have been in pretty bad shape because I do not remember checking in at the hotel in Derry." In the hotel, he was joined by the 2 Canadian sailors, one of whom he gave money to buy a bottle of whiskey from the hotel bellboy. And when the bellboy refused, the sailor said that when he returned to the room, he saw the officer on his back on the bed with this other Canadian sailor on his chest. Now, Lindstrom, the sailor who was accused of being in bed with this American, he claimed in a statement that the officer had interfered with him while they were in the room together. The officer's version of the story was that he woke up in his room to find the 2 sailors there, and then when he woke up again, he had found that his breast pocket of his uniform was open and £14 in banknotes had disappeared. After giving a statement to the police, very conveniently, this US Army officer, Lieutenant Bartos, shortly afterwards left the country. And although the larceny charge against both sailors was dropped, mainly because, according to the resident magistrate in Derry, everybody was too drunk really to know what was going on, the Canadian sailor Lindstrom was subsequently charged with gross indecency, for which he was sentenced to 3 months imprisonment with hard labour. In fact, he would have potentially gotten a worse sentence, but the jury took pity on him because of the amount of alcohol supposedly he'd been drinking. And again, it would be interesting to see what the original police file reveals about the details of this case, but certainly there's enough in the newspaper reports to give us an idea of what went on in that Derry hotel room. I've mentioned the UK and Northern Ireland, but it is also worth mentioning a case here which took place in Dublin in 1941. This is Mountjoy Square in Dublin. And this case involved Ronald Brown, who was 41 years old and state solicitor for Kildare at the time, and Leslie Price, a 17-year-old British Army deserter, and Dr. Averill Earls, who's an American academic, has written about this case in a journal, Historical Reflections, a couple of years ago. Both these men were charged with gross indecency. So Price lived with Brown in a flat at 39 Mountjoy Square, which you can see a picture of on the screen, between April and August 1941. And Averill Earls, in their discussion of the case, points out that during the Second World War, or the emergency as it was known, because you might know the South was neutral during the war, it's been estimated that over 60 men were charged with gross indecency or sexual contact with other men in Dublin. Among those charged were soldiers, doctors, woodworkers, gardeners, fishermen, bootmakers, secretaries, and lawyers, individuals from a range of different backgrounds and aged between 67 and 17. Interestingly, Earl says that the Garda managed to arrest as many men for acts of gross indecency during the war as in the 5 years leading up to it. Now, at that time, what seems to have happened in the South was that in the case of an older man and a younger man being charged for having sexual relations with each other, very often it was the older man who got the harder penalty or the harsher sentence, because he was regarded as having somehow corrupted the youth, even though it might have been an entirely consensual relationship. Unusually, though, Ronald Brown, this 41-year-old state solicitor, ended up being acquitted. And Averil Earls puts this down to a desire on the part of this newly independent Irish state to avoid having somebody as senior, a lawyer, as Ronald Brown, being caught up in a same-sex scandal. And she says this is a quote: "The assertion of Ireland's moral superiority was repeated through the 20th century, particularly with regard to Ireland's role as a producer of missionaries, priests, and religious sisters. The evidence to the contrary at home, unwed mothers, excessive drunkenness, child neglect, prostitution, gambling, and same-sex sex was forcefully suppressed or willfully ignored by the politicians and plebeians alike." So I think that's an interesting case, just giving us an idea of what was going on in the South, and particularly in Dublin during these war years as well. Now, of course, we can only guess how many of these kinds of encounters must have taken place during the war and never came to the attention of the authorities. But what seems clear from many of the oral history accounts is that, in the words of queer historian Matt Holbrook, for many men, the war was a kind of sexual utopia, containing freedoms and possibilities both absent before and after. And this is especially true given that in the post-war years in the UK, certainly, there seems to have been something of a backlash against queer men, something that has been attributed to factors including concerns over the apparent decline in sexual morality, rising divorce rates, and the declining national birth rate. Rejecting wartime morality and emphasizing the nuclear family, the 1950s seemed to have been a very difficult period particularly for queer men, and certainly there was an increased persecution of queer men. The Conservative Home Secretary, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, said this in the House of Commons in 1953: "Homosexuals in general are exhibitionists and proselytizers and a danger to others, especially the young. And so long as I hold the office of Home Secretary, I shall give no countenance to the view that they shall not be prevented from being such a danger." The figures certainly seem to speak for themselves. In 1938, 719 men were prosecuted for same-sex activity in England and Wales. In 1952, that figure had gone up to 2,109. Now, what the figures were for Northern Ireland in the same period, I can't say, and perhaps Tom, if he's willing, might shed some light on that if he knows. But I did find one interesting case, a mention in the local newspapers in 1958, when 17 men in Lurgan were prosecuted for gross indecency. This is the headline from the Belfast Telegraph in December 1958. "Man is called cancer in Lurgan society." And this man, William Wells, who was a preacher of Union Street in Lurgan, seems to have been regarded as the ringleader. But 16 other men were jailed, or were certainly charged. Many of them, not all of them, seem to have ended up in jail for gross indecency. A number of them were married, a number of them had families, a number of them as well, interestingly for our purposes, seem to have been Second World War veterans. And indeed, in the case of one of them, his defense lawyer tried to use his status as a Second World War veteran to try to plead for a lesser sentence for him. And I think it's fair to say, quoting Quentin Crisp again, "The horrors of peace were many," and it certainly seems to have been a very difficult time after the Second World War, as I say, particularly for queer men throughout the UK. Let me conclude then by quoting the words that I used for the title of this presentation from a queer veteran called Roy, who was interviewed in the late 1970s in Manchester for a project by Essex University about his life experiences. By this stage, Roy was in his 70s, and he had served in the Second World War with the Royal Army Medical Corps. And this is what he said about his experiences during the war: "It was such a lovely war. Oh, what went on was nobody's business. I went to Edinburgh. I was stationed there. The place was a riot, a riot. Yes, Edinburgh was a tremendous city. It was so full of sailors and quite easy, quite easy. The place was as if the world had gone mad because it was so easy." It might not have been such a lovely war for everyone. There's no doubt about that. But what I hope has come through in this talk is that in so many ways, the Second World War, with all its hardships, was still a time when being queer seems to have been much easier in the UK compared with other periods in our LGBTQIA plus history. Certainly that was true for Roy, and I've no doubt that it was true for many other queer men and women, both in and out of uniform. thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing, and if you have any questions or comments, I'd be very glad to hear from you. So thank you.
Michael, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And we're now open for questions. If anyone would like to unmute your device, feel free, or if you want to type a question into the chat, we can read that out for you. Okay, maybe I can ask the first one. So I just wanted to know, Michael, if you knew among the statistics, were any of those repeat offenders, or were they all one-offs, or do you know that?
Do you mean which specifically statistics, Joe?
The people who were charged with indecency.
And do you mean do you mean that case I mentioned in Lurgan, or just throughout?
Just throughout, yeah. I'm just thinking maybe some of those were repeat offences, because being convicted mightn't necessarily stop someone from cruising.
Yeah, I feel especially with you, Tom, on the call, you're the expert very much in this period of history. So Tom might be, I don't want to put you on the spot, Tom, but you might be able to answer this better than I do. I get the feeling, I know certainly from reading Emma Vickers' book, which is about, which is called Queen and Country. I'd really recommend it because it's certainly the best account, as far as I can see, in terms of the research done into same-sex experiences in the armed forces during the war. But there do seem to have been some instances of those who were prosecuted for gross indecency in the armed forces during the war. There seemed to have been maybe a minority were repeat offenders. But I wouldn't be able to say for sure. Joe, I don't know if you're able to comment at all, Tom, even in terms of your own research. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. Great talk though. Really loved it.
Thanks, Tom.
I mean, you do get some repeat offenders in the sort of first half of the 20th century, but not very many at all. And I think that's because really the police don't have any sort of handle on what is happening, especially before the 1960s. So there are a couple of examples of Royal Navy men who are arrested a couple of times, but I've not seen any sort of men arrested after the Second World War who'd already been arrested. It was quite common if someone got arrested and then served prison time, that they would then leave Northern Ireland afterwards. You know, they would emigrate to the States or to England to kind of, I guess, escape the public shame that came with the arrest.
Thank you.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, Mary Ellen, go ahead.
What was do we know, Tom, maybe you can answer it, or me, Michael, maybe you can. What was the levels of homophobia like during the Second World War? Is there any records of it?
I know, again, Tom, you might be able to comment on this better than I do. I think, I mean, what I was really surprised from, particularly from Emma Vickers' research, there were so many times where people just were accepted in terms of their military service, and there might have been a little bit of homophobia or a little bit of ribbing, but generally speaking, people were accepted. And I think there was a sense in which people, certainly officers, I mean, there's a story, for instance, about two men at the training camp and, you know, having sex in the bushes, and one of the commanding officers walking past and making direct eye contact with one of them and then just turning away. So yeah, I'm surprised by how little homophobia there seems to have been. The accounts I seem to, when I'm reading about the experiences of queer veterans, particularly after the war, there does seem to have been a real increase in homophobia, particularly after the war. Would that be fair to say, Tom?
That's exactly right. And for the reasons that you gave in your talk, the 50s are a really difficult period, and that kind of panic that spreads out from London does hit Northern Ireland, and you see a change in the tenor of how cases are dealt with as well. So some of the prison sentences in the 50s are outrageous. Much stronger than they would have been during the Second World War. You know, you spoke about 3 months for one man. There's a case in the in the late 50s, where two young sailors in a fully consensual relationship behind closed doors. One of them's given 5 years in prison.
Jesus.
You know, so outrageous things like that, and the style of policing changes as well. So during the Second World War, when men are arrested, it tends to be that the police have just kind of stumbled across them, you know, usually having sex somewhere more public. But by the end of the 50s, they're entrapping men. There's crazy cases like there's a man in Bangor who gets entrapped by a policeman who dresses up as a sailor to entrap him. And that continues into the 60s as well. So you're exactly right that the 50s is just this really terrible time. And I think before the 50s, there's a general kind of ignorance about sexuality. And where there isn't ignorance, there's more curiosity. But that changes. That atmosphere of the 50s is just horrific.
Yeah. And I mean, they talk about the lavender scare, don't they, during the 50s? But that was maybe a more of an American term.
Yeah, an American term, but I think it's a kind of international panic.
Yeah.
It's tied up with the Cold War as well. This fear that gay men, especially, are more likely to be spies, and more likely to be traitorous and disloyal, and it all kind of feeds together. And you know, obviously, in the 50s as well, you're getting a strengthening of religious feeling in Ulster with the foundation of the Free Presbyterian Church in the early 50s, and you know, so things are kind of changing, and not for the better. But it's weird in a way, because I think there's a tendency to assume that Northern Ireland was always more bigoted than other countries, and I think that's a product of the 60s and the 70s rather than the 40s, if that makes sense.
And I thought it was really interesting, that case. Were you aware of that case, Tom, in Lurgan in the 58? And I was reading the judge's remarks. He was saying, particularly because there was a preacher involved, and also one of the guys who was prosecuted had been involved with the Salvation Army. And the judge remarked about how much more disgusting it was that people associated with religion should be involved in this kind of activity. Really, you know, really, I mean, and even the headline, you know, cancer, this man is a cancer in Lurgan. Horrific stuff, really horrific.
Yeah, and the gay rights activists in England were absolutely appalled by this. The Lurgan case is still spoken about by activists in the 60s as an example of you know, how awful policing could be. I mean, anecdotally, what happened was a policeman went to the door of William Wells, who you mentioned, and pretended that he was interested in sex, and then stole William Wells's kind of address book, and then went through the address book and arrested everyone in it. So, you know, again, that's the kind of policing you got in the 50s that you wouldn't have got before.
Thanks, both of you. That's been really informative. I've just got a few questions here and some comments in the chat. And one from Nigel is, are there many more memoirs or diaries of queer World War II veterans that have survived? Are you aware of any of those?
Again, I might not be able to give a comprehensive account, Nigel. Again, Tom might know more than I do. I'm going to recommend this book. This is called Between the Acts, which is, I mentioned Roy's account at the end, who was based in Edinburgh during the war. But this is edited, I think it's from 1991. It was published, you should be able to get a secondhand copy. So it's called Between the Acts, Lives of Homosexual Men between 1885 and 1967. So it's between the two acts, between decriminalization in England, 1967, and the Criminal Law Amendment Act in 1885. This is a really lovely book. I loved reading this because these researchers in about 1978, 1979, associated with Essex University, they interviewed these men, and they are anonymous for the most part. They're given names, but I'm not sure whether they're actually their real names. But they talk very honestly about their lives, including some of them, you know, were well into their 80s by the late 1970s. So a number of them talk about life during the First World War, but a number of them as well talk about life during the Second World War as well. One of them was a dance instructor who lived in Cambridge, and talks about living near a barracks and about bringing soldiers home. And he was living with his mother at the time, and she quite happily entertained them while he was, you know, he was dating these guys. And also there was a prisoner of war camp, and again, some of the Italians, supposedly prisoners of war, were let out and went to this man's house and quite happily, had sex with him. And he also seems to have had a relationship with a German prisoner of war, who a very intense romantic relationship. So I that's a really excellent firsthand source in terms of these men just spoke very honestly and openly at the end of their lives, which I find very moving about what their lives have been like. And I have to say, although there's some tragic stories and some stories about how difficult life was, there's a lot of lovely stories as well about how accepting families had been of these men, knowing that they were, queer, and accepting them for who they were. And it brings out a whole different dimension to what life was actually like when same-sex relations between men were still criminalized.
Great. We've just got a recommendation by Kirsty. She has said that if anyone's interested in literary representations of lesbian life in World War II, you should read The Night Watch by Sarah Waters. So we recommendation there. And
Thanks,
then
Kirsty.
a comment from Nigel again. As it turns out, Canada was equally participative regarding its own lavender scare. They even tried to develop a computer program to identify queer individuals. High tech. Brilliant. Anybody got any further questions?
As it turns out, just in case people were worried, the computer program was absolute garbage, so it didn't work very well at all.
Like the TV license detector van.
Just don't let them in your house. Don't do that.
Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I'm just going to end the recording here, and if you'll stay with us.
There is only one more question that I did have. Following up on what's his name, Jeff Dudgeon's writing of books. Whenever it came to any criminal cases to do in Northern Ireland, he found one very common tactic used by anybody who tried to get away with murder, essentially, and that was called the sailor's defense. So I take it that even in wartime, whenever there was, let's just simplify it and say that it was more relaxed and you just turned a blind eye, because in war there is desperation and you don't have time for petty prosecutions. But were there any murders that happened amongst the ranks of the military during World War II, and such tactics were used to try and make sure that they weren't imprisoned for it?
I'm not aware immediately. Well, I mean, there was actually one case. There was a guy called Wiley Harris, who was an African-American GI who was actually hanged for murder during the war in Belfast. Well, he wasn't hanged in Belfast, he was hanged in England. He stabbed a pimp. So he'd been involved. It was just off where your North Queen Street is now. He went with this pimp and a prostitute to an air raid shelter, and there seems to have been some sort of disagreement broke out. Basically, I think the lady was trying to make a run for it with the guy's money, and he ended up stabbing this pimp, and he was tried at Victoria Barracks and was hanged for murder. I mean, there was a lot of alcohol taken, but even that was not used as a grounds for manslaughter. So he was actually hanged, one of the very few Americans hanged in the UK during the war. Now, I know Simon Topping, who's an academic who's written a lot about particularly the experience of African Americans during the war. He puts it down to there was a racial prejudice, and actually a lot of local churches, a lot of local people here tried to get him a lesser charge instead of being hanged, but in that case he was actually hanged. And there was also a famous case in London during the war of a man, I can't remember his name, but I think he was in the RAF, who was called the Blackout Ripper. So he was an RAF man who actually murdered a number of women in London during the blackout. So again, I talked about the blackout, how that could actually open up all kinds of opportunities for sex, be that straight or same sex, but actually that is one example of a crime that took place. There was quite a lot of crime as well, I think it's fair to say, that took place during the blackout, including in that particular instance, a series of very grisly murders in London.
But none offhand that you would know were murders motivated by.
I can't think of any
commodities.
offhand, Nigel. No, I can't think of. I wouldn't be a subject I'm hugely knowledgeable about, but those are some examples that come to mind anyway.
Excellent. Okay, I'm just going to stop the recording here.